and welcome to the 17th Imaginary Song Hunt, a monthly gathering of modern minds to reanimate lost songs from the past. Now, cultural events and artworks on the theme of remembrance tend to abound at this time of year, with Remembrance Sunday on the second weekend in November and Remembrance Day on the 11th of November. So my first thought for the November Imaginary Song Hunt was to look at a song associated with the First World War. I was mulling over that theme a while back, and I remembered one of the very first projects that I ever put together when I first started working with community choirs. And it was an evening with my Leith Hill Choir at Balcombe Memorial Hall in Sussex. We sang music associated with the First World War, and the songs were interspersed with readings from letters and diary entries by choir members' relatives, some of which were salvaged from the depths of the attic for the very first time for the occasion. And it was just unbelievably moving to hear those wartime stories of ordinary people read by their surviving relatives. And it felt like such a meaningful moment to participate in. And, you know, it's so important to pass on these personal human stories of wartime, because war is something that dehumanizes us in every way, really. Not just in the sense that people who fight are robbed of their lives and futures in so many cases, but also in the sense that the sheer scale of the loss and suffering makes it almost impossible for us to comprehend that the large numbers involved actually represent real human beings, you know, real people just like us and just like our loved ones. So in keeping with my tradition of finding a really tenuous parallel from ancient history for every single topic that we encounter on the Imaginary Song Hunt, I'm going to cite an example from Tang Dynasty China to illustrate the power and the importance of narratives that center the individual human being in stories about war and conflict. So the poet Du Fu wrote a poem that I know in translation as The Conscription, and it was written during the An Lushan Rebellion, which was this unbelievably destructive civil war that wiped out a substantial percentage of the Chinese population in the middle of the 8th century. So disclaimer here that I'm sharing a kind of a memory of what I read about this poem in goodness knows where about 15 years ago, so I can't claim 100% factual accuracy. But I remember reading that criticism of the emperor was a capital offence during this period, and, you know, probably throughout a lot of Chinese history. But in this poem, The Conscription, essentially through a little vignette recounting one small-scale incident, he's able to convey in a super affecting way the horrific consequences of the widespread draft that the Civil War demanded. And he does that without explicitly criticising the imperial policy itself. So, whether intended in this way or not, the poem demonstrates how powerful it can be to tell the story of one individual when the scale of loss is so great that individual stories are subsumed into this overwhelming multitude. The poem describes an old woman pleading with the Imperial Army's press gang to take her instead of her husband. There aren't any more men left to this household. Just my grandson still nursing with his mother. My daughter cannot leave him here just yet. And her shredded skirt is all she has for cover. But I'm an old woman. I know my strength is gone. But please let me come tonight with your convoys, if you've urgent need. In Heyang, I can be there in time to cook some breakfast for our boys. When we talk about war, and when we engage with the topic of war in our creative work, one of the most meaningful and important things that we can do is get beyond the grand narratives and the political commentaries and remember the ordinary human beings. So I wanted to put together an imaginary song hunt session loosely following the theme of how ordinary people make sense of and endure the extraordinary circumstances of war, as that theme emerges in the folk song tradition. So that's a pretty enormous topic, and I homed in on one aspect in particular because it's so ubiquitous that you could almost think of it as a kind of synecdoche for ordinary people's experiences of war in the Anglophone folk song tradition. And that is impressment, which was, in the words of Encyclopaedia Britannica, the enforcement of military or naval service on able-bodied but unwilling men through crude and violent means. So having started with an account of this brutal form of conscription in 8th century China, let's fast forward 800 odd years to the Act touching political considerations for the maintenance of the navy, which passed in 1563 during the reign of Elizabeth I. Forced conscription didn't start with this act for sure, but it marks its appearance in the statute books as an officially sanctioned legal practice, so this helps us kind of set out a rough chronology. It peaked during the 1700s and ended in 1815 after the end of the Napoleonic Wars. The rise of steam travel and presumably mechanical weapons reduced the pressure on naval recruitment. So forced conscription was able to end and didn't re-emerge in Britain until the First World War. For this session, I want to follow the thread of offering remembrance by sharing and reflecting on the experiences of ordinary people. And I want to do that by looking at the practice of impressment through the lens of women's experiences as they're narrated in folk songs. And women's narratives are especially powerful in folk songs. And I don't think they affect me particularly just because I'm a woman myself. I also think that women in literature and in song often take on the role of a kind of conduit for communal grief. And perhaps it's because of the domestic position that women were historically confined to that they become a kind of powerful plot device through which the larger scale political narrative can be focused down to the small scale personal account. And historically, across lots of different cultures, the grief of communities has really often been channeled and expressed through the women of those communities. Now, for this song hunt, I have enlisted the collaboration of my friend Clare Dyer, who I think of, obviously, among lots of other things, as a bit of a repository of folk song knowledge. And we basically just had a big old chat, drawing on our recollections of our own favourite songs and songs that we discovered, by researching a little bit around this topic. Hi, Clare!
Hello!
So, Clare, the reason that I thought it would be really cool for us to do this together is because basically you're one of those people who seems to have this encyclopedia of folk songs in your head. Yeah, I have this thing where I have a Monty Python quote for absolutely every situation. I feel like you have a folk song for every situation.
I'm definitely not an encyclopedia of folk songs, but I guess I know quite a lot, and I sort of know where to look, and I just find it really fascinating to just learn and read and connect things together and use songs as a way of looking at the past and kind of understanding the past, but also just listening to and singing really beautiful pieces of music.
Let's kick off with a question about the depiction of the press gang in folk songs, because it occurred to me that I don't really know any songs at all that convey the men's perspective on being pressed to sea and serving in the Navy and what life was like.
There's one which I think you and McCall recorded, and a bunch of people have recorded, and I think it was collected in Norfolk, called The Press Gang, which is a guy who's he says, as I walked out on a London street, a press gang there I chanced to meet. They asked me if I'd join their fleet on board of a man of war, and there's some verses where he basically talks about the fact that, he asks them what it's going to be like before he goes, he joins the ship, it turns out it was all a lie, and he gets flogged and hung up by his thumbs, and it's pretty gruesome and graphic.
They hung me up by my 2 thumbs, and they cut me till the blood did run. And that was the usage that they gave me on board of a man of war, boys. The brutality of impressment and the consequences for the people left behind, it's so ubiquitous in the folk tradition. It's obviously, for hundreds of years was such a huge part of British culture. It's like it's this kind of ever-present bogeyman, like the press gang, this terrible thing that threatened ordinary people all of the time. At least that's kind of the impression that arises from listening to the songs, because it comes up so often, and even in songs that aren't specifically about that, you see these references to press gangs. So I kind of wanted to ask you about that, because it's something that sort of confuses me, and probably highlights how wide the gulf is between official historical narratives and governmental documents and legislation and things like that, and then the actual life experiences of ordinary people, which is something that folk music really kind of invites us to reflect on so often. So I'm going to quote a press warrant of 1803, which is reproduced in the valiant sailor Roy Palmer's book that Claire and I both have, which we've been looking at. Mine was gifted to me by Caroline, Caroline Neville, a member of our choir. Thanks, Caroline, if you ever see this. Anyway, so one of the documents reproduced in this book is a warrant, and it describes, or the wording is this: seamen, seafaring men and persons whose occupations and callings are to work in vessels and boats upon rivers. Officially, the record seems to be that ordinary people weren't eligible to be taken by press gangs to serve in the Navy. So what we hear in the folk songs are all these accounts of men being stolen from their beds, or, got drunk in taverns and kidnapped, and, just it's sort of the all and sundry, everybody was just at risk. And it's not very clear to me how much this is a kind of a narrative device, how much this is part of the sort of song tradition, and how much that actually reflected reality. So yeah, I wonder what's your kind of impression from the reading that you've been doing, Claire, of the kind of the relationship between the press gang theory as it's sort of reflected in the statutes and what arises in the folk songs.
Yeah, I mean, well, I suppose I guess the answer to the sort of the reality of it is I'm not, I don't know. I'm not an expert in this area of history, but certainly, as you say, like the way it shows up in songs is it's very kind of universally to be feared. Certainly, as Britain, as a kind of island nation with a lot of coastline, there are a lot of coastal communities, ports, and places where a lot of the men would be seafarers. They'd be fishermen, they'd be working on boats, they'd have those kind of skills. And so, potentially actually in areas where that was the case, it may well have been that it really was kind of any man was up for grabs. There's a book that I found on Project Gutenberg, a book called The Press Gang Afloat and Ashore by John R. Hutchinson, published in 1914, which is, you have to wade through some pretty old-fashioned language, I think, to get to some of the points in this.
But it does always the case.
Yeah, I mean, but that highlights a few examples where essentially I suppose the issue was that the British Navy, especially in the 18th century, which I think was when the press gang was at its height, the Navy was enormous, and it was fairly insatiable in terms of the number of people needed to keep it going. There were all these kind of imperial wars, and it did happen that there were kind of examples of people who were taken who weren't actually already a seafarer, but they just happened to be unlucky. And maybe it's because it's probably a bit more unusual that it kind of gets put down in a song. It kind of captures the imagination because it's that sort of, like you say, it's a kind of a bit of a literary sort of plot device. But yeah, there are examples of farmers. I think there's a reference in this 1914 book of somebody who was a glover, so somebody who made gloves. So people from, you know, trades that had nothing to do with the sea, but who might kind of, you know, be so unlucky as to fall into the net. What's interesting is that actually, I think possibly in response to this period where the press gang kind of maybe got a bit more out of hand and was sort of slightly going beyond the bounds of what was, you know, written down in the statutes, that then laws were kind of introduced to bring in exceptions to this kind of universal sort of conscription machine. You know, it says in this book, for example, the harvester, as a worker of vital utility to the country, enjoyed a degree of exemption according to few.
Yeah, if they had to exempt specific trades, that almost in itself demonstrates how widespread the practice was, and that that it can't possibly have been limited just to seafaring.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and I think that's the thing that kind of ends up in some of, you know, some accounts as well. So from kind of also in the Valiant Sailor book, there's a kind of big selection actually of stories, you know, some of which are obviously stories related by people from the recollections of their childhood. So, you know, you have to kind of apply the appropriate kind of amount of seasoning to that. But, you know, so for example, there's somebody recalling in 1876, recalling from their childhood how in their town, Newlyn, which is, you know, kind of next to Penzance in Cornwall, so, you know, where probably most people were involved in fishing and probably therefore up for grabs, you know, with their seafaring skills. When people heard the press gang were coming, all the young and eligible men of the town would flock up to the hills and away to the country as fast as possible and hide themselves in all manner of places until the danger was supposed to be over. So I think, yeah, those things did happen. But I suppose, like you say, that's what makes it into the songs, because, you know, they're meant to entertain, and they're meant to kind of elicit emotion and you know, engage the listener. They're not meant to be kind of dry historical records of facts.
I guess, I mean,
you know,
it's more than entertainment, isn't it? With the, you know, these songs, the document of the life experiences of people who are underrepresented, you know, in the grand historical narratives. They're a corrective, you know. They're I suppose they're a means of empowering people who were disempowered. It's important to maintain a nuanced perspective, you know, and not get sucked into thinking that it's all just a kind of us versus them situation. You know, the people at the top and then the people at the bottom, there's this kind of grey area with any kind of, I don't know, paramilitary activity like press gangs. So there are lots of examples in songs of people collaborating with press gangs in order to get rid of young men that they didn't want around. So most obviously parents who didn't think a young man was good enough for their daughter. I'm thinking of, like, the example that I've got in my head is various 19th century broadside ballad transmissions of a song that I know as the Silver Dagger. And so there's British broadside ballads that have it as the Cruel Father or the Maiden's Complaint, and in that it's a night visiting song. Young man is with his lover, and her father overhears him and immediately, like, sends for the press gang, and so he gets taken away. Which is, it always seems a bit anachronistic. It's almost like he needed to have a mobile phone to make that happen. But
raise the bat signal and get the press gang in, because I don't like this man. Yeah, it doesn't seem very believable, does it? But
not super believable, no. But yeah, it comes up again and again, you know, that story, like, call for the press gang, get rid of this guy.
yeah. There's this story that's kind of variously called the Bristol Bridegroom, or there's an older version from the 17th century called the Valiant Virgin, and then a song collected in 1896 by Lucy Broadwood called the Brisk Young Lively Lad, I think, where the story is basically the same. You know, this woman is in love with a man, and her parents don't approve, so they call, the hotline, go, bring in the press gang, take him away.
Put up the bat signal.
Yeah, absolutely. And then she dresses as a man. She dresses in sailor's clothes and she goes aboard the ship. So she enlists to go and follow her, her true love to sea. She becomes a surgeon because, she's got small fingers and is good at sewing, I guess. I don't know. Um, and, there's a battle and the man is wounded and she, heals him and he's like, oh, if you were, you remind me of my true love. And she's like, aha, it's me. And then they get married and live happily ever after. And that story is kind of unchanged over basically kind of 250 years.
This couple was a walking, they loved each other well, and someone heard them talking, and did her father tell? And when her father came to know and understand this thing, then said he, from one like thee I'll free my daughter in the spring. 'Twas in the springtime of the year there was a press begun, and all their full intention was to press a farmer's son. They pressed him and they sent him out far o'er the raging sea, where I'm sure he will no more keep my daughter company. In man's apparel then she did resolve to try her fate, and in the good ship where he rid she went as surgeon's mate. Says she, my soldiers shall not be destroyed for want of care. I will dress and I will bless whatsoever I endure. This story of a young woman following her lover off to war. It's so enduring and so widespread and across such a vast historical period.
I mean, there were examples of that happening, quite a lot of examples. I understand. I haven't done a lot of reading about this, but it certainly did happen. And I think you can read those songs and you can kind of read those stories and kind of question whether they are a really straightforward sort of very simple kind of heteronormative love story, or actually just quite interesting, a lot more interesting than just that. The one I really love is William Taylor, where she follows the man aboard the ship. So it's discovered that she's a woman and she says, oh, I'm here, I'm looking for my boyfriend, have you seen him? And the captain goes, oh, well, actually he's got a new girlfriend, sorry. So she goes and shoots them both, and then is made a captain of her own ship because she's, showed her kind of military prowess. And it's not clear whether she kind of is the commander of the ship, still sort of dressed in her kind of male attire, or whether she's sort of openly gonna, kind of leading the ship as a woman. But I mean, brilliant. Like, that's a real nice kind of subversion of what's essentially quite a sort of, in my opinion, quite boring story. I think when you read some of the stories of the actual women who did volunteer, and enlist, as well as kind of reading the songs and some of the kind of plot points that happen in them, actually, I think you can there's just a whole, like, much more interesting kind of wide range of readings that you can apply to them. So I had a little look at some of these examples of real women who kind of went to sea for various reasons. And there's some stuff on the National Maritime Museum website, which is quoting, I think there was a writer who wrote a whole book about this topic and kind of looking into kind of the real women that did this. I mean, there's many examples. So one being a woman called Anne Jane Thornton, who indeed followed this pattern of, following, a man that she'd fallen in love with aboard a ship. But when she kind of, she went on her voyage, and eventually it turned out that he had already died, but she just basically stayed and continued to work as a cook on board a number of ships until she was discovered in, I think, the sort of 1830s or 1840s. But what's interesting about her is that she was really famous. There were lots of songs written about her, and she also apparently did appear on stage. Back in Britain, she was kind of a sensation at the time as this sort of female sailor. So again, as this is something that was happened for real. People would have been aware of and kind of would have found sensational or interesting.
Mm.
Another example is somebody called Hannah Snell, who was a volunteer who joined the Navy in the mid 18th century, served on board a number of ships. If you look on the National Maritime Museum and the Royal Museums at Greenwich website, there's some information which, is a great story about how she was shot in battle, potentially quite high up her leg. And because she didn't want to get discovered, she kind of refused treatment for the wound. And then, apparently she then, extracted the shot from the body herself so that she, wouldn't get discovered. But again, like similarly to the previous example, she wrote a memoir, or she sold her story, and, somebody kind of wrote a memoir, and then she was quite famous back in London at the time. So again, there's sort of there's an element of which, for those two women at least, their own lives, they kind of sensationalized and sort of turned into entertainment to kind of, to thrill or shock or kind of interest the public. And then there's an example which is kind of, I think, just totally mirrors actually what happens in some of these folk songs where, a woman dresses as a man, goes to sea, and then a woman falls in love with her, and it's all a bit, it's kind of, you can sometimes that the woman that's fallen in love with her kind of exposes her to the captain, and sort of gives the game away. But yeah, so there were two women, Mary Read and Anne Bonny, who both went to sea, both turned pirate, and apparently at one point one of them did fall in love with the other before they realised that they were both women. I mean, it's brilliant. There's so much, in
What a story.
I suppose it's an old sort of story theme, but it also isn't only a story, and actually there are, many reasons why women would actually, choose to kind of say, okay, I'm not going to kind of live this life that I'm sort of allotted. I'm going to go and do something different.
The story of Mary Read and Anne Bonny just reminded me of something that I was reading in an account of another woman, Christian Davis, whose life story was or a version, some version of something based on her life story was published by Daniel Defoe. So she lived, her lifespan crossed the end of the 17th into the 18th century. One of the kind of episodes in her life story that was just amazing was that supposedly a woman who was like a kind of camp follower. She was in the land army, I think, not the navy, but a woman who was there claimed that she'd got her pregnant, and that she had this baby, and rather than kind of reveal the reason why it couldn't be possible, she chose to just pay a sum to support this woman and her child in order to keep her secret. Her story was it sort of reminds me of Willie Taylor, because this woman, Christian Davis, she fought in the War of Spanish Succession, and she was an innkeeper's wife, and she followed her husband to war, and for many years she didn't find him, and eventually when she did, he was involved with another woman, and they kind of came to this arrangement in the end where they pretended to be brothers, and they carried on serving alongside each other. And eventually, when the truth got out about her, they sort of ended up getting back together, and because she revealed that he was her husband, and she was allowed to kind of remain in service with different duties, non-combat duties, and but he carried on being unfaithful and carrying on with lots of other women, and apparently on one occasion she cut off a woman's nose because she was involved with her husband.
Oh wow, okay.
That's kind of an amazing story, you never know what the historicity of the account is, because it's conveyed as a story to entertain in a novel, but yeah.
And I think there's other examples where, so there's a great story, which again, it's a story related in this book, The Press Gang Afloat and Ashore, about an instance at Portsmouth, I believe, where a group of women and men swapped clothes, apparently to evade the press gang, so that the press gang would come along, and and then the men would be sort of in disguise and be able to kind of get away, and then the women were taken to be kind of assessed for their fitness to serve on board a ship, and then the game was up. They were kind of discovered to be women and kind of released.
At which point the men have made their getaway.
Yeah.
You can kind of empathize with that. I find it kind of easy to imagine myself doing that. Not because I imagine myself to be heroic, but if you think about what the we all imagine ourselves to be a bit heroic. I think there's probably a bit of it in every one of us that thinks, oh no, I would do the right thing, I'd be brave. But if you think about what the consequences were for women who lost their husbands to the Navy. They weren't compensated. It's sort of well known that Navy wages were really terrible, and they were often paid so far in arrears that it was almost as if they weren't there at all. And so women who were left behind were going to struggle to take care of their children and to take care of themselves, because it wasn't expected that women would sustain themselves. The norm was that the men provided for the women, and then when the men were taken away, the women were left in danger of starvation. And so the consequences of losing your man were pretty severe, but it seems like potentially the consequences of posing as a man and being found out were not quite so bad.
But I think in a lot of songs and a lot of the kind of the stories, it's often used as a kind of comedic plot device, isn't it? It's used a lot in Shakespeare, and this idea of kind of disguise and world turned upside down and everything being kind of a bit sort of out of natural order, being sort of a source of entertainment.
Yeah, it's quite jolly, isn't it? And it's certainly it's my reaction to reading these stories as well, is to go, oh wow, that's amazing, oh ha ha ha. And of course the reality for men who were pressed into serving the Navy, and also women who were left behind, is that life was pretty awful. Their choices were awful. There's so many quite moving examples of songs and verses from songs that just convey how the women who were left behind were impacted by the loss of their men. Without the men's support, without the economic support, they were left in danger of starvation. Here's the Tender Coming from the Northumbrian Minstrelsy, which was published in 1882. Has the lines about if they take thee Geordie, who's to win our bread, me and little Jackie better off be dead. And the end of the song, Lovely on the Water, I'll quote as well, because that always sort of makes me want to cry. O Tower Hill is crowded with women weeping sore for their husbands, sons, and sweethearts, gone to face the cannon's roar. So we talked about how women would try changing places with their menfolk in order to be a decoy, to buy them some time so that they could save them. And then we have a much more kind of simple example of what women were able to do, and the very limited number of things that women had as options to them in that situation. And so that's in All Things Are Quite Silent, where the woman doesn't have a whole lot of agency, So, like, what's her role in this song? The woman, it seems to be to endure. And there's this kind of feeling of dignity that comes from this song, like you have the sense that the woman's power comes from her ability to bear this unbearable thing in a dignified way. She sings, I begged hard for my sailor as though for my life. and they wouldn't listen to her. And then some women were able to kind of resort to more devious means to try to protect their menfolk. So the song, the Weary Cutters, which I know it from the Unthanks, and it's the song. Oh, the lousy cutter, they've taken my laddie from me, and that has a verse in it. I think this is in the Northumbrian Minstrelsy as well, that says, "I'll give the cutter a guinea. I'll give the cutter no more. I'll give the cutter a guinea to steal my laddie ashore."
Mm.
I suppose there must be lots of examples of that, because people that were serving in press gangs were doing it for a financial incentive, presumably.
Yeah.
And so presumably they could be bribed by women who had the means to do that, or men. Or
I think
whoever.
so. Yeah. Oh, no, it's interesting actually, because in this statute that's in this Roy Palmer book, it says in this warrant as well, you are to take care neither by yourself or any other person to demand or receive any money, gratuity, reward, or other consideration whatsoever for the sparing to impress, or the exchanging or discharging any persons or persons impressed or to be impressed. So the fact that they had to include that,
Yeah.
to me, kind of implies that was, like you say, it was kind of a thing that people would try,
Yeah.
to kind of pay them off. Yeah, and there are lots of examples of kind of people running away, hiding, being hidden, but and communities kind of, I guess, working together to try and evade the press gang, because essentially these are men who they need at home, not just because of their loved ones, but because they needed to work and feed their families and keep the community going. But yeah, there are examples of women trying to kind of stop the press gang from taking the men. There's this great example as well here, and again in this book, which is
Roy Palmer book.
Yeah, so it's a recollection of a man called Arthur Randall in a book called 60 Years of Fenman. But it's a story that his father told him and his father told him. So this is a village somewhere inland from King's Lynn. So, on a river, seafaring men probably to be found and therefore kind of at risk. And the press gang came looking for men, although it says, as soon as news of their coming got around, it was a job to see a young man about anywhere. They'd all gone into hiding until the danger was over. So all the younger men in the district kept well out of the way, but the women folk got together, and soon there was a crowd of between 50 and 60 of them in Church Road, which leads down to the river. They waited there ready to give warning of any pressman's approach when an elderly farmer, came along on horseback, followed by a sturdy young fellow who'd been working for him. So they'd had an argument, and this man was leaving the farm, wanted to find work elsewhere. The women realised, this man was probably in trouble if the press gang saw him, so they warned him. He then ran away to hide in the house of another old man. Word got out, the press gang heard that this man was in hiding, and they went to this house and demanded that he be handed over. And this is the bit which I feel is just, it's so kind of evocative. So it says, the old man soon showed what sort of stuff true fenmen are made of, for he loaded his blunderbuss, climbed upstairs to an attic where the window was just on a level with the top of the riverbank, and shouted out that the first men who put their heads over the top of the bank would get their brains blown out. In the meantime, one of the village women had followed the pressmen to see where they were making for, rushed back to tell the others, and they all, it says, tore down the road armed with reap hooks, slash hooks, knives, and anything they could grab hold of, basically standing there, all of these women together between the river and the house to try and, fend off this press gang. And basically, between this group of women and the old man with his gun, the press gang did eventually go away, and and the young man kind of got away from.
Wow.
But yeah, it's such a brilliant story. I mean,
however embellished the account is, and however much the process of transmission down the generations would have altered it, one fact remains, which is that ordinary people in these extraordinary circumstances and under these extraordinary pressures do extraordinary things.
yeah.
It's almost impossible to imagine today what that would be like. I want to kind of close off the discussion just a little bit, kind of reflecting on sort of, beyond what these stories tell us about the historical reality and what the experiences of women were when their men were taken by press gangs, or when they chose to follow their men to war, to think about a little bit more interpretation and and popular opinion and popular beliefs, and how women were perceived, and sort of reading between the lines a little bit of these historical narratives, and thinking about how women's lives and women's options were kind of were limited by societal expectations. So something that sort of strikes me as emerging from the songs and the folk tradition that I'm familiar with is a kind of unrealistic, idealized impression of a woman as this perfectly faithful person who completely sublimates their own, desires and their own agency for their man. So it sort of comes across to me in some songs like the perfect woman is just a kind of almost like a chattel, like her role is to exist for her man. And so I'm thinking of the motif of the broken token that comes up in lots of these songs. So it's there in Lovely on the Water, come change your ring with me, love, and Adieu, sweet lovely Nancy, which has come change your ring with me, dear girl, and one which I know from the village where I grew up, which I know as the Young and Single Sailor, which is that was collected from Capel, where I grew up. And in that one, the young woman, she's walking, and a handsome young man comes along and says, "Oh, I fancy you," and she says, "No, no, no," and he's, "I'm virtuous, stay away," and he says, "Oh, but I want to marry you, and I'm really rich, and I can give you a lovely life." And she says, "No, no, you can't do that, because I was promised to somebody else, and I will be faithful to him, and I've waited for him for 7 years, and I'll just carry on waiting for him forever." And the young man, at this point, when she's proved her virtue by saying that she won't marry someone else, reveals his identity, and he, in fact, is her lover, and he brings out the broken ring that they exchanged. And so in this song, she proves herself worthy of his love through her willingness to be chaste, to not replace him, and to never marry again. And the Lowlands of Holland, that song, like that seems like quite an extreme example of that.
Last night I was a married man and lay on marriage bed. The captain, he did come to me and stood at my bed head, saying, arise, arise, you new married man, and come along with me to the lowlands of Holland, to have faced the enemy. She clasped her arms about his waist, still thinking he might stay. Up speaks the bold sea captain, arise and come away, saying, it's many a blithe new married man, this night must come with me to the lowlands of Holland, to face the enemy. No shoe, no stocking I'll put on, nor comb grow through my hair, and neither coal nor candle shall light my beauty rare. And never will I married be until the day I die, for the lowlands of Holland has parted my true love and I.
It's pretty much, I'm just going to live essentially like a monastic sort of existence, without even, I'm not going to dress up nicely, but I'm also not going to, heat or light my house. That's how miserable I am.
It's kind of religious, like
Yeah, it
that
is.
level of
Yeah.
self-denial. It's like very
Yeah.
flagellating.
Yeah. And then there's, the other Lowlands one where, I mean, she's, I'm just going to cut away my hair so no other man will find me beautiful, basically.
I don't know. It makes me feel like these are, in a way, they seem like women's stories, but this makes me think that they're men's stories.
Yeah.
Because the woman
Yeah,
that we
yeah.
see is this perfect woman. She's just an extension of the man. She offers him total fidelity, self-denial. She will be ugly if he can't have her, then no one will. That's what
Yeah.
it is. It's that kind of controlling.
But it's also painted sometimes just as a kind of expression of her grief, in a way. I mean, I like to read it in that way sometimes, because I feel like the story, like, which is just, oh, I'm so desperately unhappy because, my man isn't here, is just a bit like uninteresting to me. But the ones where it's, this is like a deep expression of her kind of sort of despair and sadness about kind of a really horrible thing that's happened to her, kind of more generally, just that feels to me more kind of interesting and engaging kind of emotionally. But yeah,
this kind of idea of cutting off your hair and making yourself ugly, and not allowing any other man to see you as beautiful, and not putting your stockings on. It's you can read it as obviously disempowering, but then there's this kind of strange link that brings it back to the cross-dressing thing. The women that make the choice to kind of cut their hair and pose as a man, they're hiding their femininity, and it's a kind of denial of their feminine sexuality. And they put themselves in this role. Of course, it's not a denial of sexuality if you take if you take the queer perspective and you look at them forming relationships with other women, and that being a motivation. But there's a million different ways to read these things always. So there's the self-denial aspect. There's the making yourself ugly because of the loss of your man. But then there's also this reclaiming of agency by posing as a man, and by being able to break out of the role that is assigned to you and is expected of you in society. So it's like it's a bit of everything.
I like, I think it's really interesting, and like how that is echoed then into these songs, and how you can kind of choose to look at them in a way which is not just fairly sort of, just this woman has turned into a kind of lifeless rock by the loss of her man, that actually it's about sort of finding agency, whether it be to do daring things and go to war and have adventure and live this sort of life which you'd never kind of imagine of doing if you were to sort of stay in your allotted role, or finding agency and power to endure and live despite tragedy.
Well, that seemed to me like a perfect place to wrap up. And so, with the hugest thanks to the wonderful Clare Dyer Smith, I would like to invite any song hunters who are watching this in real time to join me on Zoom now to share some thoughts, have a chat, and sing some of All Things Are Quite Silent. And as always, if you'd like to drop a penny in the tip jar to support the song hunt, then you will find the link in the notes below.